Everyone, I'm using a lav mic. Can you hear me, first of all? Excellent. Thank you, Martha, for the nice introduction. And I'm particularly excited to be here. I hope you're excited for this conference as well. And thank you to Mr. Engelman for setting the stage for us today. I get to tell you a story, and storytelling is not something I very often have the opportunity to engage in. I'm much more often talking about policy matters or intergenerational equity. And so the story of us will hopefully set us off for what we'll be discussing this weekend. And every good story needs a preface. So the preface for this story is, who is the us? And there's several different dimensions of who that encompasses. It's all of us directly here in the room today. It's all of us who share this concern that's brought us here about the future of our planet, of our species, the direction that we're going, how things are uncertain and how we'll deal with those uncertainties. But then us is also, in the broader sense, our whole species. It's all of the previous generations that have gotten us to where we are, and it is hopefully all of the generations that, if we prove ourselves successful, will follow from us, or who may judge us if we don't get it right. And I'm also just telling a story of us, because we're all individually bringing our own book to this broader collective narrative. And I'm going to try my best to capture some of the common themes across these narratives and discuss how they're going to interact with each other. So there are three main questions I want to address through this story, which are, first off, how did we come to be here? How did the big us, our species, get to where it is today? Secondly, I'd like to talk about where is it that we are today? Where do we find ourselves? What are we facing? And finally, where are we going to go? What's the next chapter of this story for our species and for those of us who are here? Addressing the first question then, we've already looked at a sketch of what our species has gone through in the past 10,000 years. And I might say, once upon a time, 10,000 years ago, our species first came about and had to begin addressing three key relationships that I would say underpin all of the problems that we're talking about. Climate change is a symptom. Inequality is a symptom of these three key relationships. And the first relationship to talk about in this background is our species to other species and our entire planet. And our species from the very beginning has always been very much struggling. It's like a love-hate relationship with the natural environment and our planet. It's beautiful, it supports us, we wouldn't exist and have life without it, but it's extremely difficult and challenging. And those early years of our species, when we were still learning how to domesticate crops and animals and survive, we were always seeking a more stable way of living and a more successful, abundant way of living and addressing these hardships and challenges. And we have largely succeeded at doing this. And as Bob said, we've almost succeeded too well in that our technological capacity to advance our quality of life has happened in a disconnected manner from a cultural or cognitive enlightenment about what are the implications of that growth and progression. So as much as we have a better quality of life today, that challenge is how are we going to manage our relationship with the earth in a way that will actually allow this quality of life to be sustained and endure. The second key relationship is what you might term intergenerational equity, and this is how do we deal with other people who are alive today, both as individuals, as communities, and of course as a global community of countries that frequently don't get along. And this is the key challenge in terms of how we're actually going to have that social component that allows us to address our relationship with the planet. Because if we can't even get along just within our own species, how can we expect to be able to get along between our whole species and other species and our entire global ecosystem? And the third piece then, the third relationship, is between us and the other generations of our species. And this is what I've done a lot of my work on, intergenerational equity. And the key problem here is that if we really want to be sustainable, we need to make sure we're allowing a future world that those unborn generations will be able to meet their own needs in as we have. And particularly in regard to climate change, and I'll be able to discuss this a little more on a panel later, but we have to bear a lot of the costs for transitioning to a more sustainable future, lowering our CO2 emissions. We have to take those costs right now. And the benefits are going to largely accrue to those of us who will live to be in 2050, 2100, and those who will descend from us. But we have to pay that cost today. And I'll get more into how we need to shift our mindset around that a little bit later. But those are the three key relationships that underpin all of these other problems that we have to deal with. So now to shift to question number 2, where do we find ourselves right now today? And we've already just been touching upon what a huge mess and wicked problem it is that we're facing. And I'd like to put a little more of a personal touch to that challenge. It's very easy to talk about the big issues in terms of, yes, this is going on at the global level, this is the ocean acidification going on, this is population's impact on what's going on. But our generation, and I'm going to narrow the us now more to those of us in this room, and in particular millennials, who are going to be the generation that either nudges us in the correct path that's going to be sustainable, or will be the one that is stuck in the rut that we're presently in. And we have to face that this is truly an existential threat. And there is no running from it. Geoengineering is not going to solve it. We won't technology our way out of it. And we don't have another planet that we're going to go to anytime soon. And there aren't even any close, if we could go to them, that would be as nice as this one. And it's very easy to get depressed when you would think about just how challenging that is. And if you really stop and appreciate what's going on. And I know from many of my colleagues and friends who, many of them are other youth who have been involved, say at the UN process, or some of our elders who have been working for several decades now trying to raise awareness on this. Burnout happens to people. And we're more at risk of burning out or losing hope if we're not upfront about engaging on those feelings that we're having. And there was a blog post in the New York Times a few days ago, when climate change floods the heart. And it was trying to draw more attention exactly to this issue, that we're not paying close enough attention to the emotional and psychological impacts of this crisis we're facing. I also had read previously there was sort of a hopelessness movement in the UK, not a movement in the UK, but individuals had gathered there, and they were sort of just mourning the loss of biodiversity and nature and the environment. And they had reached this kind of hopeless state. And we want to make sure that we can avoid that. And I hope that toward that end, we'll be able to have this be a safe space this weekend where, as we're talking in our breakout groups or asking questions of panels, in our networking conversations, we'll be open with each other about, yeah, I'm scared about the future. Yeah, I don't know if we're going to still be able to have a good life 50 years from now. Or do I need to contemplate not having children because I don't want to bring them into the kind of world that we're going to be possibly facing? These are very deep issues that we should be comfortable talking about. And there's also a lot to be optimistic about, which I'm going to get to. But we need to start with an honest appreciation of the difficulties. And I'm not going to stand here and say, oh yeah, it's all going to be fine. So we've got this burden of transition as well, because we are the key generation right now. And young people in particular need to have the leadership and the creativity, the empowerment to address this challenge. But of course, we're still coming into and figuring out who we are, what our role is going to be. And so that's why organizations like our task and the many collaborators you'll get to hear from later in the conference are so critical, because they're giving young people the empowerment, the tools, the awareness, education, the global thinking that they need to actually have a hope of coming up with some kind of solution, whether it's inside the box or outside the box. We need to be thinking outside the box because we need a paradigm shift. And as Einstein said, you can't solve a problem from within the same mindset that created it. And that gets to some of the work that I've done on changing our economic mindset so that it's more conducive to sustainability. And we do have then this potential through empowerment to come to an ability to deal with this problem. And this is then a perfect segue to the third and final question, which is, what's the prognosis? Where can we go from here? Because this story is very much unwritten. It's up for grabs. We don't know. We can't flip to the end and see, did our current generation actually succeed, or how did they do it? We can't cheat. And as I said, we're all bringing our individual stories to this narrative. And that's what I hope we can achieve this weekend, is together here, today and tomorrow, we're on the same page, literally and figuratively. And we'll get to, through our interactions, be figuring out how we are all going to, with our own skill sets, our own interests, our own positions and life experiences, going to be able to add our sentences to this page. And we can leave this conference with a plan, not the whole picture, not how we're going to solve everything, but an immediate plan. And you can become more engaged than you are when you came here about this issue. You'll be better educated and more empowered. And that is going to allow us to actually have authority as we write this narrative going into the future. And again, it's an interesting time. It's an interesting novel of the human experiment. And we are the ones today, what we do now, who are going to determine the ending of that novel will eventually reach. And will that have been a path that is sustainable, or will it have been one that spiraled down into something darker? And there is a lot that's already going on that is very powerfully good, and we need to focus on the fact that we are all in this together, and solidarity is extremely important. And even beyond those of us who represent constituencies in this room, we're just a few youth, young people, some elders and older generations here. What about youth in other countries, generations in other countries? And this needs to be built into a broader global movement, which is happening. And I've had the privilege so far of working with a lot of these international youth through the United Nations process, because we have a youth constituency who goes and we get together and we bash our heads against the wall trying to get our elders at the UN to actually incorporate our ideas into what they're doing. And I can talk more later about that on a panel of how we've been going about that and how that relates to an overall theory of change for what we're going to be able to achieve. So hopefully this has been a cathartic story, that I've set up what is the reality of the emotional and psychological challenge we're facing, but also that we have the tools, we do know a lot of the solutions that we need. It's just a matter of finding the willpower, the enlightenment to be able to do it. And I will recommend one book to you. It's from 1985, and the problems it's talking about then have only become more true today. New World, New Mind by Robert Ornstein. And his key point is this: our technological progression has outpaced our cultural and social evolution. And it's time that we bring those two things back into line with each other to have the kind of overarching, complex, problem-solving capabilities that we need. And it really does need to be a mental, cognitive shift. And I've seen it in a lot of young people, and mentoring can help us to get there, to bridge that gap between the way that our elders have laid the tracks for us and how youth will be able to flip the track, hopefully, to a more sustainable and long-lasting future. So please join me in that this weekend. Let's get excited, and let's have these very powerful, open, safe discussions and come up with plans and leave ready to take more action than we were at present. Thank you.